Hello students, Namaskar. Today we will be studying about sexual reproduction in organisms. In the previous sessions, we have already covered the various asexual mode of reproduction in organisms. Today we will try to understand that why the organisms they shifted from asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction. We will also cover a few terms and concepts in this part which are going to be of a lot of benefit to all of you in your further chapters. That is the chapter on sexual reproduction in flowering plants and sexual reproduction in human beings, plus the reproductive health, the next 3 chapters. So kindly you take note of these concepts and the definitions and the terms very carefully so that the further chapters will be easier to understand for all of you. So let us start off with the definition of sexual reproduction. What is sexual reproduction? Sexual reproduction is the process of development in which fusion and formation of gametes take place. That means that it is a type of reproduction in which the gametes are formed and they fuse. Now, before we move further, let us understand what is the origin of sexual reproduction. When did it originate? Sexual reproduction originated in the protistans and the simple algae. And slowly, the sexual reproduction became the main mode of reproduction in all of the higher organisms. Now, what are the characteristics of sexual reproduction? The sexual reproduction is characterized by the following points. 1. It is biparental. Usually, it involves 2 parents. Second, gamete formation takes place in sexual reproduction. Third, fertilization takes place. Fourth, the type of division that takes place in sexual reproduction is mitosis and also meiosis. Meiosis takes place in one or the other phase of the life cycle of organisms that reproduce by sexual reproduction. Another characteristic feature of sexual reproduction is that the daughter cells or the daughter organisms that are formed are genetically different from the parents. Another characteristic that sexual reproduction has a slower rate as compared to the asexual reproduction. It takes more time for multiplication of organisms, those who undergo sexual reproduction. So these are the low rate of multiplication. So those who undergo sexual reproduction multiply at a slower rate as compared to organisms that reproduce by asexual modes. So why is sexual reproduction important then? Even though it has a low rate of multiplication, it is important because sexual reproduction ensures variation. As we have seen that in sexual reproduction, the fertilization takes place and gametes from either different parents, they combine to give rise to a new individual, so it results in variations. Variations are very important for evolution to take place. So the basis for evolution on the face of earth is sexual reproduction. Evolution helps in adaptability. As The new individual, it improves with every generation as there are mixing of characters. So, the individuals that reproduce through sexual reproduction are more adaptable as compared to those who reproduce through asexual modes of reproduction. The new individuals that are formed, they have more rigor and vitality. So, it is because of these reasons that sexual reproduction is favorable, it is favored by nature, and huge number of organisms, all the higher organisms, whether it is plants or animals, they have adopted sexual modes of reproduction. After this, we come to the phases of life cycle. The life cycle of any individual consists of basically the 3 phases. The phases are as follows. Phases in life cycle. The first phase is the juvenile phase. This is the phase in which the individual is born and undergoes certain changes to reach maturity. It develops all its organs, it develops the reproductive organs and reaches to the next phase, which is the reproductive phase. Reproductive phase is that phase in which the individual is able to reproduce and produce organisms of its own kind. The third phase in the life cycle is the senescent phase. In this phase, it marks the end of the reproductive phase, and after the reproductive phase, in the senescent phase, deterioration of physiological as morphological structures in the body of the organism begins. All the organs, the lungs, the liver, the kidneys, they slowly start functioning lesser and lesser, and there are a lot of changes in the organism, and the organism moves towards senescent or aging, which finally results in death. The reproductive phase in almost all organisms is marked by many changes which are visible outwardly as well as they are present inwardly also. In the flowering plants, the reproductive phase is marked by the production of flowers. The flowering plants in the reproductive phase can be of 2 types, the monocarpic plants and the polycarpic plants. Now, what are these monocarpic plants and what are these polycarpic plants? Let us discuss them one by one. Monocarpic plants are those plants which flower once in their life cycle. After flowering, they form fruits and then they die. Monocarpic plants are usually annuals or biennials. Can you guess the example of an annual plant? For example, wheat or maybe rice. These are all annual plants which have their life cycle or complete their life cycle in one growing season. In one growing season, their seed germinates, it grows, it enters into the reproductive phase, they make seeds, they flower, they make seeds, and then they make the fruit and eventually die in one season. Those are called as annuals. Examples are like wheat and rice. Since they grow in a single growing season, so they flower only once in their lifetime. Then comes the biennials. Biennials are those which complete their life cycle in 2 growing seasons. For example, radish Fine. So, these biennials can also be monocarpic. There are certain perennial plants also, those who can be monocarpic. For example, bamboo. Bamboo is a plant which has a life period of about 50 to 100 years, and all these years it remains in the vegetative or in the juvenile phase. At the end of its lifetime, it flowers, it forms fruits and dies. Similar, another example is that of Nila kuranji or Strobilanthes, Kunthiana. This is another plant which has a life span of about 12 years. At the end of 12 years, it flowers, fruits and then dies. So, the monocarpic flowers or the plants which flower once in their lifetime, they can be either biennials, annuals or perennials like bamboo and Strobilanthes. After the monocarpic plants, let us come to the polycarpic plants. Now, what are these polycarpic plants? These are plants which have the ability to flower many times in their life cycle. You must have seen trees of mango, apple, citrus, oranges. All these trees, they have the ability to flower many times in their life cycle. They are said to be polycarpic plants. So, let's write the examples like the apple trees, the orange, guava. So, all of them, they are polycarpic plants because they flower many times. The period between one flowering and the next is known as the recovery phase, and it is during this period that the plants, they gather all the resources which is required for the next flowering and fruit formation to take place. So, this was about the reproductive phase in the plants. The animals also, they show certain characteristics during the reproductive phase. You all must have noted and must be knowing about the different physical changes that take place in human beings which mark the beginning of the reproductive phase in the human beings. There are certain physiological changes, emotional changes because of the secretion of hormones and so on. If we consider the example of the animals, then on the basis of the periodicity of breeding, the animals can be divided. So, on the basis of, what is the basis? Periodicity of breeding. The animals can be divided into two types. They can be classified into two types, that are the continuous breeders and the seasonal breeders. The seasonal breeders are those animals which breed in a particular season. For example, you must have observed the frogs, they breed in the rainy season, the lizards, most of the birds, mostly, they are all seasonal breeders. Whereas the continuous breeders are those animals that breed throughout their reproductive phase. And you must have seen, for example, the animals like goat, dogs, cow, even the human beings. All of them are the continuous breeders. Certain birds also, when they are kept in captivity, they somehow have shifted from seasonal breeding to continuous breeders, like our poultry. The hens, they also are now continuous breeders, and we are able to procure their eggs for human welfare throughout the year. Now, these continuous breeders, there are certain changes in the female that is seen in their reproductive phase. These cyclic changes can be of two types depending upon whether the animals are primates or non-primates. So, the continuous breeders, we can classify them into two types based upon the reproductive cycle that the females show. These two cycles are the menstrual cycle, which is found in the primates, including the apes, the monkeys and the human beings. And second is the estrus cycle, seen in non-primates like the dogs, cow and goats and so on. There are a lot of differences which are visible in these two kinds of cycles. We shall be taking the detail in further chapters, but to tell you broadly, the menstrual cycle is always accompanied by the flow of blood, whereas in the estrus cycle the blood flow does not take place. Then there is a strong urge for mating among the females in the estrus cycle, whereas in menstrual cycle that urge is not seen. So, these are basically two broad points of difference, but there are many other points that shall be taken in detail in further chapters. So, this is how the reproductive phase varies in the animals also. So, we have already covered the definition of sexual reproduction, the origin and the importance, and also the phases in life cycle. One thing also again I would like to take up here, that what are the different types of sexual reproduction. Now, sexual reproduction can be broadly divided into two types, syngamy and conjugation. Now, what are the main differences between the two? Let us try and understand. The types of sexual reproduction can also be classified further depending upon the type of gametes, the shape of gametes and so on, that we will take up further in the next topic. But to broadly, if we try to classify the types of sexual reproduction, we can say that it is of two types. One is syngamy and the other is conjugation. Now, how are these two types different from each other? Syngamy is complete and permanent fusion of male and female gamete. So, male gamete when fuses with the female gamete and it is a permanent fusion, then we call the process as syngamy. But there are still certain organisms in which syngamy is not visible, rather they show conjugation. Now, what is conjugation? Conjugation is the temporary coming together of the two parents and they exchange the male pronuclei between each other and then they kind of separate from each other. Now, let us try and see about conjugation in Spirogyra. Spirogyra shows conjugation. Now, how does it happen? As you know that Spirogyra is a filamentous algae and it derives its name from the spiral chloroplast that it has. So, this is the chloroplast and this is the nucleus. So, similarly, since it is a filamentous algae, so the two filaments they come to lie close to each other. Now, each cell in this filament has the ability to get transformed into a gamete. So, any of the two cells which are destined to form the gametes, the male gametes, or act as gametangia, they give out a lateral outgrowth. This lateral outgrowth touches each other at the tip. The tip of this outgrowth dissolves and a continuous tube is formed between the two cells which are going to act as the gametes. Now, what happens that after this tube has been formed, suppose this is a nucleus and the chloroplast, after the tube has been formed, which is called as the conjugation tube, the content of these cells, they condense and they condense to form elliptical gametes. So, how do they look like? So, they condense and they form kind of elliptical gametes. Okay, so they leave the sides of the cell wall and they form elliptical gametes. Now, one of this gamete, it moves from its parent plant or the parent cell into the other, and both of them fuse to give rise to a diploid structure or a zygote on this side. First, the cytoplasm moves, that is the cytogamy takes place, followed by karyogamy, and a diploid structure is formed in one of the parent cell. So, the parent plant that gives the gamete is called as the male parent, and the one that receives the gamete is said to be the female parent. So, one cell remains empty, the other has a zygote. After some times, this zygote kind of forms a zygospore, a protective covering around itself, and later on it germinates to give rise to the haploid spores. So, this is how conjugation takes place in Spirogyra, wherein one cell acts as the male gamete and the other acts as a female gamete. So, these were the types of the basic types of two types of sexual reproduction.